Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the History Desk. As always, I'm Jonathan, and I'm glad that you are joining me for another episode. Last episode, we discussed the New York campaign, ending with the Continental's retreat into New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Though they had fought hard in many of the battles, they were outmatched and lost control of New York, which would stay in British hands to the end of the war. In this episode, we are going to discuss the New Jersey campaign, including what is called the 10 Crucial Days, or simply the days that would make or break the revolution in the colonies. The tide would need to turn in the favor of the colonists if they wanted the war and their independence to make it into 1777 and beyond. So let's look at how these events took place and what they meant not only for the war effort, but for the fledgling country. So here we go. In the early parts of December 1776, the Americans' morale was extremely low. They had recently been ousted from New York by the British and their Hessian mercenaries, and the Continental Army was forced to retreat across New Jersey. 90% of the soldiers who had served on Long Island were gone, either by desertion or their enlistments were up, and they went home. Many more would desert, believing the cause of independence to be lost. Even Washington himself would express some doubts when he wrote his cousin saying he thought the game was pretty much up. At the same time, in the small town of Trenton, New Jersey, was occupied by 4 regiments of Hessians, about 1,400 men, under the command of Colonel Johann Rall. Washington's force comprised of 2,400 battle-able troops, with infantry divisions commanded by Major Generals Nathaniel Greene and John Sullivan, and artillery under the direction of Brigadier General Henry Knox. Washington had stationed a spy in Trenton by the name of John Honeyman, who posed as a Tory or someone who was loyal to the king. Honeyman had served in the French and Indian War under Major General James Wolfe in the Quebec campaign, including the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, and he had no trouble establishing his reputation as a Tory in the town. Honeyman was a butcher and bartender and traded with the British and Hessians, which enabled him to gather intelligence and to convince the Hessians that the Continental Army was in such a bad way that they would not be able to attack Trenton. Shortly before Christmas, he arranged to be captured by the Continentals, who had orders to bring him to Washington unharmed. After reporting to Washington, he was imprisoned in a hut to be tried as a Tory in the morning. A small fire was set to allow him to escape and return to the British lines. On the evening of the battle, the commander of the Hessian Rall was celebrating Christmas with his troops at the farm of Abraham Hunt, who was a wealthy merchant and farmer in Trenton. Hunt played the role of friendly loyalist host, giving Rall a false sense of security while Washington and his troops were preparing for a surprise attack. The Americans' plan relied on launching coordinated attacks from 3 sides. General Cadwalader would launch a diversionary attack against the British garrison at border to New Jersey to block off reinforcements from the south. General James Ewing would take 700 militia across the Trenton Ferry to seize the bridge at Assunpine Creek to prevent the enemy troops from escaping. The main assault force of 2,400 men would cross the river 9 miles north of Trenton and split into 2 groups, one under General Greene and the other under General Sullivan, to launch the pre-dawn attack. Sullivan would attack from the south and Greene from the north. Depending on the success of the operation, the Americans would possibly follow up with separate attacks on Princeton and New Brunswick. During the week before the battle, American advance parties began to ambush enemy cavalry patrols, capturing dispatch riders and attacking Hessian pickets. The Hessian commander, in an attempt to emphasize the danger his men were facing, sent 100 infantry and an artillery detachment to the British commander at Princeton. Washington ordered Ewing and the Pennsylvania militia to try and gain information about Hessian movements and technology. Ewing instead made 3 successful raids across the river. On December 17th and 18th, they attacked an outpost of Jaegers, and on the 21st, they sent fire to several houses. Washington put constant watches on all possible crossings near the Continental encampment on the Delaware, as he believed General Howe might launch an attack from the north on Philadelphia if the river froze over. On December 20th, some 2,000 troops led by General Sullivan arrived in Washington's camps. These were troops led by Charles Lee before he was captured by the British. The same day, an additional 800 troops arrived from Fort Ticonderoga under the command of Horatio Gates. On December 14th, the Hessians arrived in Trenton to establish their winter quarters. At this time, Trenton was a small town with about 100 houses and two main streets, King Street and Queen Street. Carl Van Donop, Rawle's commander, had marched south to Mount Holly on December 22nd to deal with the resistance in New Jersey and had clashed with some militia there on December 23rd. Donop, who despised Rawle, was reluctant to give him command of Trenton. Rawle was known to be loud and did not speak English very well, but he was a 26-year veteran with a great deal of combat experience. His request for reinforcements was turned down by British Commander General James Grant, who disdained the Americans, thinking them poor soldiers and unable to attack in the winter conditions. Though Rawle's great combat experience, he was not liked by his men. Trenton lacked city wall fortifications, as many towns in the colonies did at the time. Some Hessian officers advised Rawle to fortify their town, and two of his engineers advised a redoubt to be constructed at the upper end of the town and fortifications to be built along the river. The engineers went as far as drawing up plans, but Rawle disagreed with them and thought his men could take the Americans if they came, saying, "Let them come, we will go at them with the bayonet." As Christmas was getting closer, more and more loyalists came to Trenton to report that the Americans were planning some kind of an attack. U.S. deserters told the Hessians that rations were being prepared for an advance across the river. In public, Rawle denied these rumors as to not to worry his men, but in his private letters to his superiors he said he was worried of an imminent attack. He wrote Donop that he was liable to be attacked at any moment. Rawle said that Trenton was indefensible and asked British forces to establish a garrison at Maidenhead, present-day Lawrenceville. Close to Trenton, this would help defend the roads from Americans. His request was denied. As the Americans began disrupting the Hessian supply lines, the other officers started to share Rawle's fears of an imminent attack. On December 22nd, a spy reported to Grant that Washington had called a war council, and Grant sent a message to Rawle to be on guard for American actions. The main Hessian force of 1,500 men was divided into 3 regiments, Keppenhausen, Lossberg, and Rawle. That night, they did not send out any patrols because of the severe weather. Before Washington's troops left, Benjamin Rush came to cheer up the general who had been down since the retreat from New York. While there, he said a note to Washington had written saying, "Victory or death." This phrase would become the password for the surprise attack. Each soldier would carry 60 rounds of ammunition and 3 days of rations. When the army arrived at the shores of the Delaware, they were already behind schedule, and clouds began to form above them. Rain began, but as the temperature dropped, this turned to sleet, then snow. The Americans began to cross the river with John Glover in command. The men crossed in Durham boats, which were large flat-bottomed boats used at the time for movement up interior waterways of the colony. The horse and artillery went across on large ferries. The 14th Continental Regiment of Glover manned the boats, as they had in the New York campaign. During the crossing, several men fell overboard, including Colonel John Hazlitt, who was quickly pulled from the water. No men died on the crossing, and all artillery made it across in good condition. 2 detachments of infantry, each about 40 men, were ordered ahead of the main columns to set roadblocks ahead of the main army and were to take prisoners of any who came into or left the town. One of the groups was sent north of Trenton, and the other was sent to block River Road, which ran along the Delaware River to Trenton. The weather conditions delayed the landing in New Jersey until 3 a.m. 3 hours later than planned had called for at midnight, Washington realized it might now be impossible to launch a pre-dawn attack. Another setback occurred when it was made known that General Cadwalader and Ewing were unable to join the attack because of weather conditions. At about 4 a.m., the soldiers started to march towards Trenton. Along the way, several civilians joined as volunteers and led as guides, such as John Mott, because of their knowledge of the area. After marching about 1.5 miles through the winding roads into the cold wind, they reached Bear Tavern, where they turned south onto Bear Tavern Road. The ground was slippery from the sleet and snow, but the terrain was level, making it easier for the horse and artillery. They began to make better time. They soon reached Jacob's Creek, where with some difficulty the Americans were able to cross. The 2 groups stayed together until they reached Birmingham, present-day West Trenton, where they split, with Greene's forces heading east to approach Trenton by the Scotch and Pennington roads, and Sullivan's heading southeast to approach from River Road. Soon after, they would reach the house of Benjamin Moore, where the family offered Washington food and drink. Many of the troops did not have shoes, so they were forced to wear rags around their feet, and some were cut and bleeding, turning the snow a dark red. 2 men would die on the march. As the men marched, Washington rode up and down the column, encouraging his men to continue. General Sullivan sent a messenger to Washington, saying the weather had made his men's gunpowder wet. Washington would reply by telling Sullivan to have his men use the bayonet, as he was resolved to take Trenton this night. About 2 miles outside of town, the main force met up with the 2 advanced parties. They were started by the sudden appearance of about 50 men, who they thought might be Hessians, but were in fact Americans. They were led by Adam Stephen, and they had no knowledge of the planned attack on Trenton and had just come from attacking a Hessian outpost nearby. Washington was worried this attack had alerted the Hessians in Trenton to their plans, but he ordered the advance to continue to Trenton anyway. In actuality, Rawle had thought the attack by Stephen and his men was the attack in which Grant had warned them of, and that there would be no further action that day. At 8 a.m., an outpost was set up by the Hessians at the Cooper Shop on Pemberton Road, about 1 mile north of Trenton. Washington led the assault, riding in front of his soldiers. As the Hessian commander, Lieutenant Andreas Werdeholt, left the shop, an American fired on him, but missed. He shouted, "De Fiend!" or the enemy, and other Hessians came out. The American fired 3 volleys, and the Hessians won. Washington ordered Edward Hand's Pennsylvania riflemen and a battalion of German-speaking infantry to block the road that led to Princeton. They attacked the Hessian outpost there. Werdeholt soon realized he was more than a raid, and when he saw other Hessians retreating from the outpost, he ordered his men to do the same. Both of the Hessian detachments made organized retreats, firing on Americans as they fell back. On the high ground at the north end of Trenton, they were joined by a duty company from the Losberg Regiment. They engaged the Americans, retreating slowly and keeping up continuous fire, using the houses for cover as they fell back. Once in Trenton, they gained the covering fire from other Hessian guard companies on the outskirts of town. Another guard company, nearer to the Delaware River, rushed east, leaving open the river road into Trenton. Washington ordered the escape route to Princeton to be cut off, sending infantry in battle formation to block it, while artillery formed at the head of King and Queen Streets. Leading the southern U.S. column, General Sullivan entered Trenton by the now abandoned River Road and blocked the only crossing over the Assunpine Creek to cut off the Hessian escape. Sullivan briefly would hold up his advance to make sure and give Greene's forces enough time and drove the Hessians from their outposts in the north. Soon after, they continued their advance, attacking the Hermitage, the home of Philippin Dickerson, where 50 Jaegers under the command of Lieutenant von Grothon were stationed. Lieutenant Gronhausen brought 12 of his Jaegers into action against the advance guard, but as soon as he saw a column of Americans advancing to the Hermitage, pulled back to the Hessian barracks and was joined by the rest of his men. After the exchange of 1 volley, they turned and ran, some trying to swim the creek while others escaped over the bridge, while had been cut off. 20 British dragoons also fled at the sight of the colonial forces. As Greene and Sullivan's columns pushed into the town, Washington moved to the high ground north of King and Queen Street to see the action and better direct his troops. By this time, U.S. artillery from the other side of the Delaware had come into action and was devastating the Hessian positions. With the sounding of the alarm, the 3 Hessian regiments began to prepare for battle. The Rawle Regiment formed on King Street, along with the Losberg Regiment, while the Kappenhausen Regiment formed on the lower end of Queen Street. Lieutenant Peel, Rawle's brigade adjutant, woke his commander, who found the rebels had taken the V of the main streets in town. This position is where the engineers had recommended the building of the redoubt to protect the city. Rawle ordered his regiment to form up at the lower end of King Street, and the Losberg Regiment to prepare for an advance up Queen Street. The Kappenhausen Regiment was to stand in reserve for Rawle's advance up King Street. The U.S. cannon stationed at the head of the 2 main streets soon came into action. In reply, Rawle directed his regiment, supported by a few companies of the Losberg Regiment, to clear the guns. The Hessians formed ranks and began to advance up the street, but their advance was soon broken by fire from the guns and Mercer's men, who had taken houses on both sides of the street. Breaking rank, the Hessians fled. Rall ordered 2 3-pound cannon into action. After getting off about 5 rounds each, half the Hessians manning the guns had been killed by the U.S. cannons. After the remaining men fled to cover behind houses and fences, the cannon were taken by the Americans. Following their capture, men under the command of George Whedon advanced down King Street. On Queen Street, all Hessian attempts to advance up the street were repulsed by the guns under the command of Thomas Forrest. After only firing 4 rounds each, 2 more Hessian guns were silenced. One of Forrest's howitzers was put out of action by a broken axle. The Knipenhausen Regiment became separated from the Lossberg and Rall regiments. The Lossberg and Rall regiments fell back to a field outside of town, taking heavy losses from grape shot and musket fire. In the southern part of the town, Americans under Sullivan began to overwhelm the Hessians. John Stark led a bayonet charge at the Knapenhausen regiment, whose resistance broke when their weapons would not fire. Sullivan led a column of men to block off escape of troops across the creek. The Hessians in the field attempted to reorganize and make one last attempt to retake the town so they could make a breakout to safety. Rall decided to attack the U.S. flank on the heights north of the town. Rall yelled and cheered on his men, and the Hessians began to move, with the brigade's band playing fifes, bugles, and drums to help try to lift the spirits of the men. Washington, seeing the Hessians were trying to attack his flank, moved his troops to assume battle formations against the approaching enemy. The Hessian regiments began marching toward King Street, but were caught in the U.S. fire that came from 3 different directions. Some Americans had taken up defensive positions in houses to reduce their exposure, and even some civilians had joined the fight against the Hessians. Despite this, they continued to advance, recapturing their cannon. At the end of King Street, Knox, seeing the guns retaken, ordered his troops to retake them. 6 men ran after, and after a brief fight, secured the cannon, turning them on the Hessians. With most Hessians unable to fire their guns, the attack stalled. The Hessians' formation broke, and they began to scatter. Rall was mortally wounded when he was shot twice in the side and was carried back to his headquarters, set up on the house of Stacy Potts, where he would die later that night. Before his death, he would request a formal surrender to Washington. The note informing him of the imminent attack was found in his coat pocket after his death. Washington led his troops down from the high ground, encouraging them to press on. Most of the Hessians retreated into an orchard, the Americans in close pursuit. They were quickly surrounded and offered terms of surrender, which the Hessians agreed. Although ordered to join Rall, the remains of Keppenhausen Regiment mistakenly marched in the wrong direction. They tried to escape across the bridge, but found it had been taken. The Americans quickly swept in and defeated a Hessian attempt to break through their lines. Surrounded by Sullivan's men, the regiment surrendered just minutes after the rest of the brigade. The Hessian forces lost 22 men killed in action, including their commander Rall. 83 were wounded and 896 captured, including the wounded. The Americans had only lost 2 deaths during the march and 5 wounded in battle, including a near-fatal wound to future President James Monroe. All 4 Hessian colonels in Trenton were killed in the battle. The Lossberg Regiment lost so many captured or wounded, it was removed from the British rolls. The American captured many much-needed supplies, including approximately 1,000 arms and ammunition, tons of flour, dried and salted meats, ale, and liquors, as well as shoes, boots, clothing, and bedding. All things the much-needed ragtag Continental's forces, including many fresh horses. Washington would soon learn that Cadwalader and Ewing were not able to make their crossings, which left only his worn-out army of 2,400 men in Trenton isolated. Without the other 2,600 men of their groups, Washington soon realized he did not have the forces needed to attack Princeton or New Brunswick. By noon, Washington's forces moved back across the Delaware into Pennsylvania, taking with them their prisoners and captured supplies. The victory at Trenton greatly increased the morale of the men in the army, netting them much-needed supplies. The battle would also cause General Cornwallis to leave New York to engage Washington. After the Battle of Trenton, Washington faced a severe problem. All but a few of his men's enlistments were ending in December 31st, and he believed that the army would collapse unless he convinced them to stay. On December 30th, Washington appealed to his men to stay just 1 month longer for a bounty of $10. He asked any man who volunteered to poise their firelocks, but no man turned out. Washington rode his horse up and down the formation, giving a rousing speech to his men, telling them they would never again have the opportunity to render such service to the cause of liberty and their country as they did at this moment. Men slowly stepped forward, and in the end only a few refused the offer. On December 31st, Washington learned that an army of around 8,000 men under General Cornwallis was moving to attack him at Trenton. On January 1st, 1777, money from the Continental Congress arrived in the forces in Trenton, and the men were paid. Washington also received a series of resolves from Congress, including one that gave Washington powers similar to that of a military dictator. Washington decided that he would stand and fight in Trenton, and ordered General Cadwalader, who was at the Crosswicks with 1,800 militia, to join him in Trenton. Washington ordered his men to build earthworks that were parallel to the south bank of the Assunpink Creek, southeast of Trenton, near the modern-day Trenton Transit Center. The lines extended about 3 miles down the south end of the stream. One of Washington's aides, Joseph Reed, pointed out there were fords upstream that the British could cross, and they would be in the position to drive into Washington's right flank. Washington could not escape across to Delaware because all of his boats used in the early attack were a few miles upstream. Washington told his officers that he planned to move the army and their current position was only temporary. Cornwallis had been planning on returning to Britain to visit his wife, had his leave canceled after the attack on Trenton. He rode to Princeton to catch up with General Grant, who had moved with 1,000 troops to reinforce the town. When Cornwallis arrived, he was convinced by Grant and Carl Convop to attack Trenton with their combined force. On January 2nd, Cornwallis left part of his force in Princeton under the command of Charles Mawhood, and with 5,500 men set out down the road to Trenton, which was 11 miles away. Cornwallis's army had with it 28 cannon and marched in 3 columns. When he reached Maidenhead, he detached Colonel Alexander Leslie with 1,500 men and ordered them to remain there until the following morning. Out in the front of his army, Cornwallis placed a skirmish line of Hessian Jaegers and British light infantry. 2 days before Washington had troops under the command of Matthias Alexis Roche de Fromay placed an outer defensive line halfway between Trenton and Princeton, with a mission of delaying the British advance. As the British advance approached, Fromay returned to Trenton drunk, causing Colonel Edward Hand to take over his command. As the British came within range, the American riflemen opened fire. The Americans took cover in the woods, ravines, and even in bends in the road, and each time the British line would line up to fire at them, they would fall back and fire from cover. After Hand was forced to abandon the American position along 5 Mile Run, he took up a new position in a heavily wooded area on the south bank of Shabakunk Creek. Hand deployed his men in trees where they were so well protected from view that the British could not see them as they crossed the bridge over the stream. The men opened fire at point-blank range. The intense fire confused the British into thinking that the entire American army was against them. They formed into battle lines, bringing up their cannon. The British searched the woods for half an hour, looking for the Americans, but Hand had already withdrawn to a new position. By 3 in the afternoon, the British had reached a ravine known as Stockton Hollow, about half a mile from Trenton, where the Americans were forming another line of defense. Washington wanted to hold the British off until nightfall, when the darkness would prevent the British from attacking in his defenses on the south side of Assunpink Creek. The British, with their artillery in position, attacked Hand's new position, and he gave way slowly, falling back into Trenton. Along the way, Hand had his men fire from behind houses. As Hand and his men came to the creek, the Hessians charged them with bayonets fixed, causing some chaos among the Americans. Seeing this, Washington rode out through the crowd of men crossing the bridge and ordered Hand's men rear guard to pull back and regroup under the cover of American artillery. As the British prepared to attack the Americans' defenses on the opposite side of the creek, musket and cannon fire was exchanged by both sides. The British then moved across the bridge, moving in solid columns, and the Americans all fired together. The British fell back, but only briefly. The British charged the bridge again, but this time they were driven back by cannon fire. British charged the bridge for a final time, but the Americans fired canister shot, and the British were raked with fire, causing heavy casualties. One report stated that the bridge looked red as blood, with their killed and wounded and their red coats all mixed together. When Cornwallis arrived in Trenton with the main army, he called a council of war to determine where he should attack. Cornwallis's quartermaster, General William Erskine, urged him to attack at once, stating that if he did not attack now, they would not find Washington and his army there in the morning. Grant disagreed and argued that there was not a way for the Americans to retreat, and the British were worn out. The rest would do them good, and the attack in the morning. Cornwallis did not want to wait until morning, but he decided that he would be better than sending his troops out to attack in the dark. Thinking he had Washington and the army trapped, Cornwallis moved his army to a hill north of Trenton for the night with a plan to attack in the morning. During the night, American artillery under the command of Henry Knox occasionally fired shells into Trenton to keep the British on edge. As Cornwallis did, Washington also called for a council of war. He would take the little-known Quaker road leading to Princeton, and his council agreed with him to make an attempt against the British garrison there. By 2 a.m. on January 3rd, the army was on its way to Princeton. Washington left behind 500 men and 2 cannon to keep the fires burning and make noise with picks and shovels to make the British believe they were digging in. By the morning, these men too had evacuated, and when the British launched their attack, they found all the Americans were gone. At dawn, the army approached a stream called Stony Brook. There, the army followed Stony Brook for a mile further until it intersected with the post road from Trenton to Princeton. However, off to the right of the road was an unused road which crossed the farmland of Thomas Clark. The road was not visible from the post road and ran through cleared land to a stretch from which the town could be entered at any point because the British had left it undefended. However, Washington was running behind schedule, as he had planned to attack and capture the British outpost before dawn and capture the garrison shortly afterwards. By the time dawn broke, he was still 2 miles from town. Washington sent 350 men under the command of Brigadier General Hugh Mercer to destroy the bridge over Stony Brook in order to delay Cornwallis's army when they found out Washington had escaped. Shortly before 8 a.m., Washington wheeled the rest of the army down the unused road. First in the column was General Sullivan's division, consisting of Arthur St. Clair and Isaac Sherman's brigades. Following them were Cadwallader's and Daniel Hitchcock's brigades. Cornwallis had sent orders to Mawhood to bring the 17th and 55th British regiments to his army in the morning. Mawhood had moved from Princeton to fulfill these orders when his troops climbed the hill south of Stony Brook and sighted the main American army. Not able to determine the size of the army because of the forested terrain, he sent a rider to warn the 40th British Regiment, which he had left in Princeton, then wheeled the 17th and 55th around and headed back to Princeton. That day, Mawhood had called off a patrol which would have been searching the area Washington and the army were coming from. Mercer received word that Mawhood was leading his troops back to Princeton and was given orders from Washington to move his column to the right in order to the British before they could confront Washington's main army. Mercer moved towards Mawhood's rear, but when he realized that he would not be able to cut off Mawhood in time, he decided to join Sullivan's troops. When Mawhood learned that Mercer was in his rear, moving to join Sullivan, he detached part of the 55th Regiment to join the 40th in town and moved the rest of the 55th and 17th and 50 cavalry and 2 cannon to attack Mercer. Mawhood ordered his light troops to delay Mercer while he brought up his other detachments. Mercer was walking through William Clark's orchard when the British light infantry appeared. The British light troops' fire went too high, allowing Mercer to wheel his troops around into battle lines. Mercer's troops advanced, pushing back the British light infantry. The Americans took up position behind a fence at the upper end of the orchard. However, by this time, Maher had brought up his troops and a cannon. The American gunners opened fire first, and for about 10 minutes, the outnumbered American infantry exchanged fire with the British. However, many of the Americans had rifles which took longer to load than the muskets of the British. Maher ordered a bayonet charge, which also took advantage of the rifles situation as they could not be fitted with bayonets, causing the Americans to be overrun. Both the American cannons were captured, and they were turned on the fleeing troops. Mercer was surrounded by British soldiers, but he declined to ask for quarter. The British, thinking they had caught Washington, bayoneted him and left him for dead. Mercer's second in command, Colonel John Hazlett, was shot through the head and killed as well. 50 light infantry were in pursuit of Mercer's men when a fresh brigade of 1,100 militia under the command of Cadwalader approached. Maher gathered his men, who were all over the battlefield, and put them in the battle line formation. At the same time, Sullivan was at a standoff with a detachment of the 55th Regiment that had come to assist the 40th Regiment. Neither moved towards the main battle for fear of exposing its flank. Cadwalader attempted to move his men into a battle line, but they had no combat experience and not known even the most basic military maneuvers. When his men reached the top of the hill and saw Mercer's men fleeing from the British, most of the militia turned around and ran back down the hill. As Cadwalader's men began to flee, the American guns opened fire on the British, who were prepared to attack, and the guns were able to hold them off for several minutes. Cadwalader was able to get one company to fire a volley, but it fled immediately afterwards. At this point, Washington arrived with the Virginia Continentals and Edward Hand's riflemen. He ordered the riflemen and the Continentals to take up a position on the right-hand side of the hill, and then he rode to the fleeing men. Washington shouted to inspire them and get them to stop and fight. This worked, and the men formed a battle formation in Washington's direction. When Daniel Hitchcock's New England Continentals arrived, Washington sent them to the right, where he had put the riflemen and the Virginians. Washington, with his hat in his hand, rode forward and waved the Americans forward. At the same time, Maher had moved his troops slightly to the left to get out of the range of the American artillery. Washington gave the order to not fire until he gave the signal. When the British were only 30 yards away, he turned on his horse and told his men to halt and fire. The British fired at the same time, and many, including Washington's officer John Fitzgerald, thought that when the smoke cleared from the two armies firing at the same time, they would see Washington dead, but he was unharmed and waving his men forward. On the right side, Hitchcock's New Englanders fired a volley and then advanced, again threatening the British flank. The riflemen were slowly picking off the British, while the American artillery was fired grape shot at the British lines. At this point, Hitchcock ordered his men to charge, and the British began to flee. British made an attempt to save their cannon, the militia also charged, and Maher gave the order to retreat. The British fled towards the post road, followed by the Americans. Some of the Americans had swarmed the post road in order to block the British retreat across the bridge, but Maher ordered a bayonet charge and broke through the American lines, escaping across the bridge. Some of the Americans, Hand's riflemen among them, continued to pursue the British, and Maher ordered his dragoons to buy some time for the retreat. However, the dragoons were pushed back as well. Some Americans continued to pursue the fleeing British until nightfall, killing some and taking some prisoner. After some time, Washington ordered the army to return back, and rode back to Princeton. At the edge of the town, the 55th Regiment received orders from Maher to fall back and join the 40th in town. The 40th had taken up a position just outside of town on the north side of a ravine. The 55th formed up on the left side of the 40th, sending a platoon to flank the oncoming Americans, but it was cut to pieces. When Sullivan sent several regiments to scale a ravine, the British fell back to a breastwork. After making a brief stand, the British fell back again, some leaving Princeton and others taking up refuge in Nassau Hall. Alexander Hamilton brought up 3 cannon and had them blast away at the building. Then some Americans rushed the front door and broke it down, causing the British to put out a white flag outside of one of the windows to surrender. 194 British soldiers walked out of the building and laid down their arms. After entering the town, the Americans began to loot the abandoned British supply wagons and the town to collect more much-needed supplies that the army was without. With the news that Cornwallis was approaching, Washington knew he had to leave Princeton. He wanted to push on to New Brunswick and capture a British pay chest of 70,000 pounds, but Major Generals Knox and Greene talked him out of it. Instead, Washington moved his army to Somerset Courthouse on the night of January 3rd, and then marched to Pluckerman by January 5th, and arrived in Morristown by sunset the next day for winter encampment. After the battle, Cornwallis abandoned many of his posts in New Jersey and ordered his army to retreat to New Brunswick. The next several months of the war consisted of a series of small skirmishes known as the Forage War. And there we have it. Washington has come forth. He's fought a very important battle of Trenton and Princeton, saving the army from disintegrating into itself. He's got much needed supplies, winter clothing, food, ammunition, and he's gone back to Morristown, where he's going to spend the winter. Cornwallis has pulled his troops out of New Jersey, and they're concentrated around New Brunswick now. And you have these little skirmishes called the Forage War, where both sides go back and forth trying to find food and supplies. We're going to talk about that early in the next episode, because it's really the interlude between two campaigns. But these are the battles that saved the Revolution in late 1776 and early 1777. If not for these victories, Washington could not have held his army together. He would not have been able to convince people that the cause was still worth fighting for. But he was able to do so with the midnight crossing of the Delaware. We've all seen the picture of him standing on the prow. He actually sat down. But these two important battles, showed everybody that he could beat the British. The army could stand and fight. It could take towns from the British. Of course, the war is far from over, but it showed that they could win, and they could stand toe-to-toe with this massive, amazing British army that had never lost. But the war's not over. In our next episode, we're going to talk about the Saratoga and Philadelphia campaigns, which were these British advances in 1777. Those campaigns that Howe had planned and asked for troops in his plan when he set up winter quarters before these attacks on Princeton and Trenton. And this is 1777 is a very important year, both for the British and the Americans in this war. It's before the French come in. It's before, we've got the Continentals and the Americans, they still have to show to foreign nations, Spain, France, anybody they're trying to negotiate with, that they can stand toe-to-toe with the British. These minor skirmishes at Princeton and Trenton, they haven't shown that. They just showed to the people in the Americas that they could stand. They have to prove in an international scope that they're worth backing. They can stand up. This is not a failed revolution. On the British side, they need to try to end this before anybody else steps in and funds or troops, or French, mainly the Spanish, any of their enemies step in on the side of the colonials. So they need to end this. And they think they can do this in 1777 with Saratoga and Philadelphia. But that's going to be for next week. If you would like to support the channel, there are many ways to do it. Share it with your friends. Let them know about it. That would be great. I'd be appreciated if you'd like to financially support the channel. There will be links in the show notes. Of course, all financial support will go to improving equipment and editing software. And outside of that, I would like to thank you for joining us in this week's episode. And as always, never stop reading, never stop learning. Keep history alive. Share it with everybody. It's the only thing we can do to keep it alive. But until next time, everyone, I'm Jonathan from the History Desk. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.